che siamo nel treno.
Scusate se vi sedete, ricominciamo, grazie. Barzanti, lascia stare la bartocina, non mi cismare, dai. Già fatto. Prego.
Accomodatevi per cortesia. Grazie.
Okay. Only one more hour between you and the beer. Because I only saw agua. This is not a good thing. Guys, let's pick up the story, and because there's important stuff we need to talk about so that you can go back to your organization and do safety differently and get them to do safety differently. That's the empowerment and the invitation I want to give to you, all right? But I want to do so not on the basis of faith, but on the basis of data, on the basis of evidence, of good ideas also. Before I say anything else, let me confirm that I do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. All right? I think this graph really neatly shows that these things in and of themselves are not bad ideas. They have helped us create great success. All right? And if we go back to each one of them, there are merits to these ideas. There are benefits to these ideas. I think no controller, no ATCO is, and this was said earlier this morning, essentially, is a safe controller if they don't understand the moral implications of what it is that they're doing. Yes, you develop psychological mechanisms to cope with that every day so that you're not thinking of dealing with thousands and thousands of lives. But ultimately, if you don't realize that is what it's about, I think we have an issue. So, absolutely. And we want people to have the right knowledge and the right expertise to do the job. I think standardizing certain tasks and finding one best method for how to do something is not a bad idea in itself. But it doesn't always work. It only works in specific circumstances. It works when the world is relatively closed, right? When you don't have a lot of influences from the outside. And it works when the task is predictable and repetitive. Then you can standardize. But for many things, the world is too complex and too unpredictable to hold people to that one best method. So for certain situations, it works wonderfally and we shouldn't throw it away. For other situations, we shouldn't expect it to work as well. All right? Accident prone. Sure, there are individual differences between people. This is why we select. This is why you have very strict selection for controlling, right? Not everybody is fit for that sort of job. And even after that, some go on to supervision, some go on to other things. And so, of course, individual differences matter. But to explain everything on their basis is not a good idea. Building error-tolerant and error-resistant designs is a very good investment in safety, and I think we're not doing enough of it, right? In fact, Dr. Alanzi's talk very much indicated that we have a long way to go, right? Get the user involved earlier, right? Understand the liability implications early on. So there's a lot of work to be done. Still a good idea. Monitoring your system for the holes is not a bad idea. These are all smart things to do. Incidents can predict other incidents, and in some cases, right, back to the idea of similarity, they may even predict bigger issues, though not always. So I am not saying let's throw all of that away. What I am saying is that we cannot count on those strategies to make us even safer. If we only keep doing all of this, we're going to keep getting what we have been getting. And we will remain asymptotic. That's my message. All right? The major enemy of safety today, as we said, is success and perhaps the bureaucratic administration of safety. The bureaucratic machinery of safety that works against being safe at this level. Let's look at that last challenge. Why is bureaucracy a bad idea? For safety at the level where we are? Well, first of all, the problem with bureaucracy is a lack of improvement from bureaucratic safety initiatives. Gambatese and Hallowell did a study 2 years ago in which they ran through 13 typical safety interventions and studied which ones are associated with the most safety yield, so the most safety benefit. And those that are the most bureaucratic interventions are at the bottom of the list. At the top of the list are three things that are not normally associated with bureaucracy. At the top of the list is leadership, and leadership understanding of the importance of safety. This is consistent with, and you've seen the word already on one of Yvonne's slides, high reliability organization theory, HRO. They keep saying this as well. Their research keeps returning the idea that leadership involvement in and understanding of safety is absolutely critical. This is why this sideways MBA recruitment of leaders who run ATNSs in Europe is perhaps not a very smart idea, because they are there for a few years. They've been running a chicken feed factory or a toilet paper factory before, and it's only 1,700 people. I can deal with that. I have an MBA. I know how to manage, right? It's this Harvard Business School model that presumes that managing is a generic activity that doesn't require detailed knowledge of the messy work that goes on inside of the organization. Having been a pilot in an airline, which is one industry that in many cases is still run by pilots, though even that is changing, I would disagree with that. I would disagree with the idea that in a safety critical industry, you can be managed by someone who doesn't understand that safety critical work. I don't think it is necessarily smart. So leadership is at the top of the list. Let's go to the bottom of the list. You know what's at the absolute bottom of the list? The bureaucratic initiative that gives the least safety return on investment? Emergency response planning. It's essentially useless. Emergency drills. For a variety of reasons. One is that the phone numbers that are on the drill are always out of date. Right? But I think, Comandante, I'm losing my name. Chiara Lanzi. No, that's... Leganzi, okay, thank you. Already mentioned the example, showed the picture, Qantas 32, right? What's the emergency response plan that Airbus gives you? Here, 120 procedures on your ECAM, right? Rather useless, right? Which is exactly why the crew at some point looked at each other and said, let's stop. Let's stop chasing one warning after another as if we're going through a bloody phone book of things to do, right? By the time you work through all of that, you're out of gas, right? And so at some point, that emergency response plan demands adaptation, right? A good emergency response is context sensitive. This is why bureaucratically planning it in advance is at the bottom of the list. All right. Let's look at the list again because let me just check. Right. The two other things that are at the top of the list of initiatives that are good for safety are contractor management. Now this is interesting. When you look at even your organization, where a lot of the maintenance and software updating can sometimes be contracted out, an investment in safety is making sure that those contractors know what they're doing and that they are somehow integrated, that they know from each other what they are doing, so that systems don't start to display funky interactions that were unanticipated and unpredicted. So managing this web of contractors well is number 2 on the list. Number 3 on the list is employee involvement. It sounds so simple, right? But we actually need research to prove this, that involving you in safety issues is a smart way to invest in safety. Yet, in a bureaucratically organized system, that may not seem very obvious. In fact, go back to what Tony Liku was saying, right? We get the procedure writers who understand the ICAO rules, they will translate it for you, and they will produce this stuff for you. Not you, no, they. So that is not a smart idea, and the research backs that up. Let's go back to the bottom of the list. So at the absolute bottom is emergency response planning. At the third up from the bottom is written safety policies. So written safety policies are pretty useless as well, because they hardly ever match reality. And very often they are just motherhood statements. You know, safety is our number 1 priority. Well, if it was, you would tell everybody to stay on the ground, right? Your priority is to make cash, right? That's why you live. So, safety policies based on nonsensical or patently false commitments like that have no credibility and no value in terms of investing in safety. So, the second from the bottom, and this is interesting, is record keeping and incident analysis. Is second from the bottom. Record keeping, right, as in the trends of the performance and things like that. And then incident analysis is second from the bottom. Why would that be? Well, we've already seen that the relationship between incidents and accidents in very safe, complex systems is very loose. So the predictive value of your incident analysis for your accidents is very low. All right? The other thing is that much of the incident analysis that goes on, and again, Tony has already commented on this, is often done by people who don't do the work. Right? Safety people may not be those, for example, who are controllers, who have been controllers, who understand the messy details. And so the value of an analysis is going to be limited because of that. They will miss subtleties. They will miss the nuances of the dirty details of what it takes to get the job done every day, right? And the fact that there's always going to be a gap between how work is imagined and how work is actually done. And that gap is filled by your experience, your resilience, your expertise, your insight, your trickery, right? They will miss that because they don't do it themselves. And so the value of incident analysis is, in that research, shown to be very limited. So the first problem of bureaucratically organizing safety is that the typical bureaucratic initiatives don't create a lot of safety. They just create a lot of paperwork. They create a lot of meetings. They create a lot of emails. They take managerial and operational attention away from what matters, because how often are people out in the ops room trying to understand how work really goes on? They can't, because they have the next meeting to discuss closing out the incident reports from the last month, right? Which includes a rolled ankle from one contractor who was in the radar processing room and tripped over a cable or something silly like that, right? So they spent their time on bureaucratic uselessness. So a lack of safety improvement takes away time from what matters. The next one . The next thing that a bureaucracy creates is accountability up. And this, to me, is both a practical and an ethical concern, and a serious one. I have seen, and this goes very much for air traffic control, many organizations where over the past 20 years, there has been a gradual shift from seeing safety as a responsibility down toward those operators who do the safety critical work, toward an accountability up to those whom you need to answer to. The board, the manager, the unit supervisor. You need to make sure that your numbers look good. A very obvious example is from an air traffic service provider from another part of the world, which has decreed, and in a public forum where the minister was present as well, I told the safety chief of that organization that that was just the most idiotic thing to do, the stupidest thing to do, because it has been decreed in that ATNS, air traffic service provider, air traffic navigation provider, that each operational unit is allowed a maximum of 6 high potential incidents per year. That is your budget. You are not allowed more incidents. If you have more than 6, your unit will be penalized, will be punished, will be sanctioned. Resources will be taken away. You will get put out and to be viewed, pilloried by the other units so that they can go, B team, right? And so, how many units do you think have more than 6 high potential incidents? No one! You know the tricks well. Exactly. What do human systems do? We become really smart at calling things by some other name. Right? As in, nah, that wasn't really 4.7, was it? It was... these boundaries become negotiable, right? If you give me a budget of 6, I'll give you 6. In fact, I might even give you 4, just to look better, right? This is what bureaucracy does. It creates this pressure to be held accountable upward in the organization. And ultimately, what matters is not the incident frequency rate. What matters is what David Capers, a colleague of mine, calls the LGI. There's only one number, he says, and that's the LGI. And I go, Dave, what is the LGI? The LGI is the looking good index. Right? So bureaucratically organizing safety is about a looking good index. And if your unit's LGI is of a particular value, you will go through the year without being bothered by those above you. And the board will be happy, and the CEO will be happy, because they don't really understand controlling from chicken feed anyway, so, right? Their numbers look good. The regulator is happy. They won't audit you because, if you have more than 6, we will audit you, right? We will bother you with more paperwork requirements and more meetings. So bureaucracy creates this pressure for accountability up, which I believe actively works against the interests of the organization and actively works against safety. It goes back to what you said about being fearful of sharing bad news, right? Which, and it was mentioned, was it your talk or the GM example? No, it wasn't your talk. The General Motors example, might have been Tony. Right? No? It was Tony. Okay. So General Motors, a culture where bad news could not come to the boss, right? Because that would not be loyal to the company. Right? Again, that's all about this accountability up. You don't want to look bad in the eyes of those above you. And that's typical for a bureaucracy. All right? I think it is actively bad for safety. The other thing, we've been talking about fixed rules. Some rules actively create a lack of safety. And you may have some examples from your own operation, but there is no world that I have worked in that doesn't have rules that actually make things less safe. Right? This may be as simple as telling your people outside who are, in the summer in Rome, working on a VOR installation, trying to put some things up there, right? Telling them to wear long sleeves, hard hats, steel cat boots, right? Carry a defibrillator because it might happen that in 45 degrees somebody gets problems with their heart, And so we have all kinds of fixed rules. And if you want to be a contractor for your organization, you have to abide by those rules. Otherwise, you can't work on our VOR installation, right? Now, those rules and applying them actively makes people dehydrate and overheat and get in trouble, right? Make them work in shorts and a baseball cap rather than anyway, right? So give them that freedom. So fixed rules sometimes create a lack of safety if you are completely compliant with them, right? And they certainly would create a lack of production. Now, perhaps the fourth and final problem that bureaucracy creates, and Yvonne has already alluded to this, given the complex world that we have today, is that it doesn't want diversity. It doesn't want initiative. It doesn't want novel thinking, right? It wants compliance. It wants you to do what the book says you should be doing. Now, in a predictable, fixed world, that's fine, because it won't spring any of those fundamental surprises on you. But the world in aviation is not fixed, right? It is so complex that it will generate these emergent fundamental surprises where all of a sudden all kinds of things come together, like in Überlingen, right, that are so hard to predict for anybody. If all you can do is respond by fixed rules and standard procedures, you won't be able to meet those challenges, right? You want your people to be able to have a diverse set of responses. So for these reasons, I think bureaucracy actively works against the interests of safety. Bureaucratically organizing safety may not be the smartest way to go in 2014 when the major risk is this gradual drift into failure. All right. So, what do we do about that? How can we deal with that meaningfully? Let me give you an example, which was suggested to me by a good friend and colleague, Don Harris, who we had a conversation about this, and he said, look, there's a great example from the Second World War, actually, back to the Second World War, Where Abraham Wold, a statistician, he was born in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and moved to the Allies and was asked to help with the following problem. Allied bombers that went from England into Germany and back were, of course, shot at, both air-to-air and ground-to-air. And some of these airplanes, of course, didn't make it back. Some did. Many did. Many who did had lots of holes in them, all over. Abraham Wold was asked to use his statistical skills to find the areas where these airplanes were the most vulnerable. So from all the airplanes that came back, he counted the holes. He inventoried the holes. He made maps of the holes and started building a statistical database for where the holes showed up in these airplanes in order to be able to recommend to the manufacturer where to put more fortification or armor in these airplanes. Now, you want to be really careful with putting armor in an airplane because it cuts into payload and it cuts into range, either or both, right? So you want to be very judicious with that. You can't just put it everywhere. He came back after months with the results of his analysis. And it is very like our 1980s hunt for the holes that are the incidents that we believe would predict our accidents. Right? We want to patch over these holes. Show me where the holes are and let's close them up so they can't become an accident. So the logic and the response was, well, Abraham, thank you for your analysis. You will probably tell us exactly where most of the holes are in the fuselage and in the wings and in the tail for us to put the armor. And Abraham Wold says, no, that's not where the armor should go. The armor should go, he says, where there are no holes. Because those are the ones that don't make it back. Exactly. But it is completely counterintuitive. Right? But this goes for you, colleagues. This goes for you. Your armor in your organization should go where there are no holes. Because those are the things that you don't know about. That's exactly the normal work that goes on every day. These frustrations, these workarounds, these little frustrations that you don't report, that don't become a hole, but that do become Überlingen. That's the inspiration. Put the armor where there are no holes, because those are the planes that don't make it back. The ones with the holes make it back. Look, they're here. Right? That's the inversion of thinking that we need in order to make progress on safety beyond this asymptotic trajectory. Put the armor where there are no holes. But what is that armor? What is that armor? In order to answer that question, let's invert yet another thing. All right? Because we have seen, as I drew this line before, that all of the ideas previous to our current era are based on those two themes. People are a problem to control, and safety is an absence of negatives. That's taken us to where we are today. I am convinced, on the basis of the data I have seen, on the basis of the messy details of many of the high-profile accidents that I've been uncomfortably close to over the past years, right? Close enough to see the messy details, the ambiguities, the gaps in explanation, right? On the basis of that, I will want to argue that we should not see people as our problem to control, but people are our resource to harness. People are the solution. People are not the problem. People are the solution. And rather, and this is of course completely consistent with where resilience engineering is, Rather than seeing safety as the absence of negatives, we should see safety as the presence of positives. That's what we should be counting. That's what we should be looking for. That's the armor that we can put in the places where there are no holes. But what are those positive capacities? What is typically coming out of the resilience engineering playbook right now? What are some of the things that literature is telling us? What are some of the positive capacities, competencies, and capabilities that we can put in the places where we don't see holes? One of the things that keeps coming back in various forms is teams that keep a discussion about risk alive even when everything looks safe. Teams that keep talking about risk even when there are no holes. That's the armor that goes in that place where there are no holes. They keep a discussion about risk alive even when there is no obvious risk. Why? Because you've done it every day. Now, where do we do that typically? Briefings and debriefings, right? What is the quality of those in your units? How much of a habit have they become, right? Thank you again for handing that one to me, right? How much is in a handover briefing nowadays? I'm not saying, oh, you should be Boy Scouts and we should draw up rules for how to do a handover briefing. And if you don't comply, we will have a just culture process, right? That's not what I'm saying, because then we're back in 1911. And I don't want to go back to 1911, because solutions from 1911 are not going to make our system any safer. They're just going to keep us where we are. I want you to think about that handover briefing as a positive capacity that you insert as that armor that you put into place where you see no holes. Because that there are no holes is exactly what's dangerous. Because those are the ones that don't come back. Right? So, keep that discussion about risk alive, even when everything looks safe. The research is crystal clear on this. Teams that do this are more resilient, have better outcomes. All right. The second one is the ability to accommodate fresh viewpoints, dissent, people who disagree. This goes at team level, but even goes at very tiny team level, right? This, of course, is the very notion on which crew resource management was once based, right? The ability to speak up, the ability to show dissent, the ability for the view from below to speak up and be heard, right? And again, it goes to what you were saying earlier about the ability to hear bad news, not having fear for bringing bad news, right? If there's anything in your organization at whatever level that somehow disincentivizes you to bring bad news to those above you or around you, you may be one of Walt's airplanes that won't come back. It's not a hole, because you're not writing incident reports about it, because you're not saying anything. So there's no hole, right? But it is a problem that may become an accident at some point. What is your ability to accommodate, invite bad news, fresh viewpoints, dissenting voices, voices from below? How is that organized? When you are in a position of shift supervisor, do you ever start the day with your people by saying, guys, I am here for one reason only. That's not because I'm smarter than you. It's because I've been here longer than you. Right? Other than that, I have no privilege. Which means we are here with however many pairs of eyes and ears we have. And I'm counting on all of you to tell me the bad news. I want to hear bad news. In fact, if we go home today without you having told me bad news, we've had a bad day. We are creating a walled airplane that may not come back. Right? I have flown with many captains, and I would have hoped that in whenever I started flying the 7-3, in 2007 I started, So this is after I'd been professor for a while, and so I was bored with that, and so I started flying, and as one does. And so I've flown with captains who absolutely didn't want to hear from below. They didn't want to hear from me. Their idea of a co-pilot was, gear up, flaps up, shut up. Right? And so that was it. Right? Their hands would be all over the cockpit. Right? The idea that my boy, there is a line down the cockpit. Everything on this side of the line is mine. Everything on that side of the line is also mine. Yeah. Those guys, they still exist. They still exist. All right? I've flown with a bunch of female captains. They don't tend to be like that, actually. But I've also flown with guys whose very first words when you sit down in the cockpit are this: Sid, if there's anything about what I do that you don't like, I need you to speak up. And I'll do the same with you. That's all it takes. That's all it takes to create an environment where armor goes in a place where there is no holes. It is that simple. It doesn't have to be harder than that. Is your shift supervisor doing that? Are they inviting bad news? Are they inviting negative feedback? Are they inviting critique? You see, you are not there for your ego. You are there to create safety every day. Right? I am not convinced that, for example, the current generation of team resource management training in air traffic control is doing this very effectively. Persuade me differently, right? Show me that your TRM training, if you have any, but you probably do, does this really well? I don't know. But that's where the armor should go, because those are the places where there are no holes. Right? Are you keeping that discussion about risk alive? Do you have the capacity to listen to bad news, to invite dissent, to invite a different viewpoint from below? And so those are some of the prescriptions that come out of the resilience thinking, right? That show where armor can go in the place where there is not yet a hole. I think those are the ideas that we need to work on in 2014. The perhaps really interesting discussion, if I were a manager, and the research bears this out, and Eric Holnagel will say this at any opportunity, the interesting discussion that the manager, the shift supervisor should have is not about safety. Are you safe? Do you know how to be safe? Let me put up a poster that tells you, here's how you be safe, maintain your SA, whatever that means. Instead, they should talk about work and the messy details of work. Tell me what's frustrating about work. Tell me what's not working well today. Tell me why you couldn't do what you wanted to do with that arrival sequence. Tell me, right? Those sorts of questions. Those are the questions that will lead to insights. You don't want questions like, what was unsafe about what you did today? Because the answer is, well, absolutely nothing. Because I am a responsible and competent controller, right? So that discussion is not going to go anywhere. Talk about work. Let's understand work, right? And the messy details. The gap between how we think it goes on and how it actually goes on. And then don't try to close that gap by saying, well, you should be better Boy Scouts. We need better compliance. No. Try to understand that gap as people's investment in resilience, the armor that goes into the places where there's no holes, right? How does this relate to a just culture? Because it goes back ultimately to the question raised by you about, being fearful, fear of speaking up, being one of the major nemico della sicurezza, thank you, sicurezza. And so, how do we deal with that? I think, and so this book still needs to be written. I've written 2 versions of Just Culture by now. And I think I've got it wrong, actually, by saying that we should balance safety and accountability. I don't think they can be balanced. I suppose they need to work in each other's favor. That really is what we need to do. That the way we hold each other accountable works in the favor of safety rather than the opposite. There are many cases in which holding each other accountable works against safety. Because we make examples out of people, we punish and sanction them, which shuts others up, makes them fearful of sharing similar experiences. And so, when I talk about just culture now, what I want to do is focus on what happens inside of your organization. All right? Let me not discuss too much the outside, the judicial environment, because in my understanding, you actually have a conversation ongoing in Italy about that now, after the very, very bad experience with Linate, obviously, and its aftermath, which has been devastating and terrible, not only for your colleagues, who were criminalized, prosecuted, charged, jailed, the works, but it's been devastating for a climate of openness, sharing, learning, and ultimately devastating for accountability. In my understanding, there is a careful, slow conversation going on. And so that definitely needs to continue and perhaps even accelerate and expand. But let's look inside of your organization. The original idea of just culture, which in fact I've always had trouble with, but has been that anything that happens, anything negative that happens, errors, violations, what we want to call them, can be divided into white, gray, and black. White is something that's an honest mistake, and so we'll let you go. Gray is sort of risk-taking behavior, and so we need to give you a warning. As your German colleagues might call it something like a Belehrungsgespräch, right? Which, even if you don't know what it means, sounds pretty nasty, right? So that's true very quickly for German, I suppose, but that's beautiful language, actually. But Belehrungsgespräch, a teaching conversation, right? That's what it means, a teaching discussion. I'm smart, you're dumb, I need to teach you how to be less dumb, right? And so here is how. How can I teach you to be less dumb? Follow the procedure and everything will be all right, right? And we're back in 1911. And it's 2014, right? But apparently those conversations are still being held between managers and controllers today. So, Belehrungsgespräche. I don't think that it's easy to divide behavior into white, gray, and black. I have in my book used the Gain definition of negligence, and it doesn't matter what definition for negligence or recklessness or risk-taking you might take. All of these definitions are very long, and they are based on lots of judgments. Remember the definition for negligence? You may have seen some of this material. You may have read my book, you may not. I don't read them either, so don't feel bad. I might now, because I now have an Italian copy, so I have to read that. That would be fun. Be difficult, but the typical definition of negligence will read something like, negligent behavior is that which, according to the standards current in the community, it is judged to be below reasonable care that would be taken by reasonable people under reasonable circumstances, things like that. Lots of those sorts of words. People doing what is normally taken as reasonable in that community of reasonable actors, and words of that nature. Now, first of all, those definitions are legal definitions and not human performance definitions. But the problem is, whenever you draw a line on the basis of such a definition, somebody is going to have to decide what is reasonable. Somebody is going to have to decide what is normal. Somebody's going to have to decide what is below or above or at standard in a particular community at a particular time. These are not self-evident or God-given definitions. These are lines that need to be drawn by humans, by somebody who needs to make a judgment about these things. So the question, and you know this because I've said this many times, is not where the line goes. The question is who gets to draw it. That's where justice lies. Not the location of the line, but in who gets to draw that line. And what troubles me very much is that we have organizations, you may not be one of them, we have organizations where that line gets drawn by those who don't do the work themselves. So how are they to know what is reasonable in a community, in a particular context at 3 a.m. in that sector? How are they to know? How can you give the power to draw that line to them if they don't know the messy details of what it takes to get the job done in that context? That, to me, is an abuse of power. Right? And so, the question is, or I think rather than not even the question, the conclusion that I think we can draw from that is that there is no line between white, gray, and black. There is no line. There are only people who draw it. There is no line. There's only people who draw it for a particular circumstance. Right? Are you willing to build a just culture model on the confidence that other people will draw that line fairly for you? Really? All the time? Is that a concept of natural justice? And once the line is drawn, what is the opportunity for appeal? In any mature justice system, there is always an opportunity for appeal. Appeal in Italian would mean, as in appello, right? There's always an opportunity for appello. Is there an opportunity for appello? Is it meaningful? Is it real? Or is it just window dressing? Right? All of those questions need to be answered if you want to create justice. Because again, I think that justice and a just culture doesn't really lie in the outcome, but in the process. If people consider the process to be just, then they are much more likely to accept the outcome. But if they don't consider the process to be just, then no matter what the outcome is, they will not see it as just. Does that make sense? Right? Are you willing to go there? Are you willing to entrust people in your organization, even if it's your peers, to draw that line fairly, equitably, justly? And so, I think perhaps rather than a model of just culture that is thus bureaucratically administered, right, with definitions and fixed rules for what happens if something is deemed to be negligent and reckless or risk-taking or just an honest mistake. Again, that's a bureaucratic administration of justice. I think anything based on that is necessarily suspect and difficult. Perhaps we can start thinking about a completely different way of creating justice, which, again, doesn't see people as a problem to control and categorize and put in boxes. No, but sees people as a solution to harness. I think a new just culture algorithm, and those who read hindsight would have seen the proposal, I think in 18 or 17, probably 18. Wow, amazing fan. You remember what the steps are? Just in anticipation. Oh, I'm going to listen to this guy. I gotta read up a little bit. So, that's good. That's good. So the first step that I think we should ask is: does your organization ask who is responsible, or what is responsible? And how much of who and how much of what do your managers typically want to know? And you know where I believe justice lies, right? In fact, back to the Second World War. What was the whole insight of that inversion of thinking in safety? It was asking the question, what is responsible for these airplanes belly flopping? Not who. Because it didn't matter who. It didn't matter who you put at the controls. It could happen to everybody. And because it can happen to everybody, which is pretty much true for the work you do, the question should be, what is responsible for creating the conditions that made this outcome more likely? Not who is responsible, but what is responsible. So this should be your first rule of thumb. When you deal with your superiors, with your people, with people you are responsible for, How much of who do you ask, and how much of what do you ask? And try to ask more what and less who. All right? That would be my first rule. The second is, to what extent are you integrating knowledge, intimate knowledge, of the messy details of practice, of work, in this whole process? Is justice created by people who are bureaucratically sidelined in some staff department? Or is justice created by peers, by those who do the work themselves, who understand intimately what you go through when you're sitting there right post-morning peak, right? Who understand the human performance implications of that, just coming off peak, right? Which is a tricky time to be in. We know this from the data. You probably know this from your data, right? And so, do they understand those messy details, those nuances, those subtleties of practice? The more they do, the more likely it is that any outcome from a just culture process will indeed be seen as just. All right? Some people may come back and say, well, but if you let colleagues judge each other, it will lead to, holding hands above heads, right? And protecting each other and patronage, and that is not just. I have yet to see convincing evidence of that. Yes, there are some cases where that may have happened. If you look at medicine, for example, they have done that sort of justice for a long time. It's only the last 10, 20 years that prosecutors have muscled in from the outside to start judging doctors. And they don't know what they're talking about. This is the problem, right? It's always been done by peers, by colleagues before. And colleagues are not necessarily interested in getting each other off the hook. Because if one colleague really makes everybody else look bad, then you will act on that. You will do something about it. This is normal for social constellations, right? No system of justice is perfect. I can't claim that, right? And this one isn't either. But this will be seen as fairer, more equitable, and more reasonable, and more just by those to whom it is administered. So those, the first 2 points, right? How much of who is responsible versus what is responsible is asked. The second question is, how much of the messy details, right? How much of the knowledge of messy details is integrated in the process, right? And gets to do the judging. The third one is, to what extent are you exploring opportunities for what is called restorative justice, rather than retributive justice? Retributive justice is typical of justice systems. Retributive justice says, if someone was hurt, then we need to respond with more hurt. That's what retribution means. And of course, people who oppose that idea will say, an eye for an eye? Before too long, the whole world will be blind. There's something to that, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's actually but anyway, so retributive justice, hurt needs to be met with more hurt. Restorative justice throws that on its head and says hurt, or the potential for hurt, needs to be met, responded to, with healing. If there's been hurt, we need to start healing. How do we do that? Restorative justice runs, and there's a lot of literature on this, I'll be really brief. Another recent book of mine, Second Victim, came out last year, talks about this in greater detail. But restorative justice is based on the idea of the utmost importance of relationships of trust. Controlling works on trust. You are trusted with the lives of these passengers. You are trusted to do a good job at 3 a.m. when there's nobody there watching. You are entrusted with high technology. You are entrusted with safety critical processes. You are entrusted with the lives of people who have absolutely no say in the matter. who cannot come back and say, yes, I'm booking Lufthansa 897 tomorrow, but I would really like the Lucia to be my controller. Right? They can't do that. You have no choice, which means that there is a relationship of complete trust that you guys know what you're doing. Because people have no control over it. None. All right? Those whose lives you hold in your hands have no control. And so, what is mostly hurt in a near miss, in an incident, is that relationship of trust. And that needs restoring. How can these passengers trust you again? How can your supervisor trust you again? How can your colleagues trust you again? So restorative justice is about confronting the event together, not with an eye on punishment and sanction and retribution and more hurt, but about having a conversation of how to restore that trust. How can we trust you again with this? And communities have ways of figuring this out, particularly smaller communities that are tightly knit, like yours. All right? So there's great potential for restorative justice as opposed to retributive justice. Now, some managers don't like that. They will come back and say, but I need to be seen to be doing something. Otherwise, everybody thinks I'm a wet newspaper, right? Or a sloppy towel, or whatever metaphor you use in Italian. A weakling. Okay, he's thinking of something. Are you going to voice it? Probably not. No, it's not. Okay. It's not politically correct. Okay. I think you all know what Felice is thinking. I cannot be seen to be weak. I need to act. And if anything, the regulator expects me to act. Right? However, grazie. No, I know. It's good. Thank you. Grazie. I think that over the long term, there are many ways to show your boss, your colleagues, your employees, and even your regulator that there are multiple different ways of acting that have great consequences for safety. One is to be very retributive and punitive. One is to be restorative, work on the relationships of trust, and show that this is a model that can work and that has great precedence in lots of other fields. Patient safety, criminal justice, right? Lots of fields this has been tested, tried, and found rather successful. So there is a future for this. Somebody needs the courage to start doing it and show that it can work. Right? Can you carve out that space for restorative justice in your unit, in your organization? All right? You may not want to go that alone. You may need some extra help, obviously. But the model is there. The fourth question that I would want to ask, there's only 5, then I'm done. Fourth question I would want to ask for a just culture is, to what extent is the accountability that you are demanding backward looking? Is it about looking back at the incident and say, oh, you went wrong there, you violated that procedure, you didn't follow this, you were non-compliant there, and thus everything screwed up there. And now we blame you for it, right? That's backward-looking accountability. The question is, how much forward-looking accountability can we have instead? This is Ginny Sharp's question. She came up with it in the context of patient safety, but it applies very much to your organization. What does forward-looking accountability mean as opposed to backward-looking accountability? Forward-looking accountability is obviously not about the past and not about blaming, but about the future and prevention. It asks the following question: what actions do we collectively need to take to make repetition less likely? And how are we going to hold each other accountable for the effectiveness of those actions? And when are we going to hold each other accountable for that? When are we going to ask questions about the implementation of that versus this? When are we going to talk to each other again? How are we going to check? How will we know? Those are the questions that you need to already explore right here in order to create forward-looking accountability. Because that's a creation of accountability into the future, rather than just blaming in the past. We've seen that backward-looking accountability tends to shut up that conversation. It tends to create the fear of speaking up. It tends to make people feel treated unjustly. Forward-looking accountability makes people stakeholders, problem owners, co-creators of solutions. And they will want to be held accountable for their part in creating a safer system. 4 months from now, they will want to tell you, yes, we've done this, we've implemented this, we're now moving this, So forward-looking accountability is opposed to backward-looking accountability. How much of that is going on in your organization? Ask yourself that question. And finally, the fifth one is how much second victim support effectively do you really have in place? I think the history, and your field has been pretty good at this as opposed to some others, the history of treatment of second victims. And what is a second victim? A second victim would be a practitioner who has been involved in an incident for which they feel personally responsible. It typically gives them bad dreams, recurring experiences, even trauma-like experiences, avoidance symptoms. I had all of these psychological symptoms that have been dealt with in fact, some of the Eurocontrol guidance that has been written about this stuff. How does your organization, or how does the union, or how does the association deal with its second victims? I think there is a strong link, and I make that claim in that 2013 book. I think there is a strong link between the resilience of an individual and the resilience of an organization. If the organization is willing to go to the individual and say, you probably might feel a little bad about what happened. How are you doing? What can we do for you? Then that organization is also willing to face up to its own weaknesses, to its own imperfections, to its own issues and problems. If, on the other hand, the organization is not interested to see its people as second victims, then it may be living in a lot of denial that bad things can even happen, or that people may feel personally really taken and bad for what has happened. A strong link between organizational resilience and learning and individual resilience. All right? Those 5 questions, I think, should animate any move to adjust culture. All right? Who versus what is responsible? The messy details. All right? Knowledge of the messy details. Restorative versus retributive justice. Forward-looking versus backward-looking accountability. And finally, the amount and meaningfulness of second victim support. I don't advocate a bureaucracy to administer all of that. I think that would be bad. Some administration is necessary to make it work. But to put it in the hands of management, to put it in the hands of a staff organization, probably takes something of the soul, of the essence, away from it. All right. Colleagues, it's been a very long day, so let me just finish on the final exhortation, which is, again, let's stop just seeing our people as a problem to control. Let's stop measuring safety as an absence of negatives. Let's invert this. Let's see each other as solutions to harness. And just imagine what that does for your image of humanity, for your image of your colleagues, of your fellow human beings who you work with every day. Right? See them as solutions, as resources to harness. And see the strengths, capabilities, competencies, and capacities of your colleagues as what really makes safety. Right? That is how you should measure safety, in the presence of those positives, not in the absence of negatives. Thank you very much. I think we should move on to a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Sydney.
Just one moment.
Okay, I think it's question time. sono domande? Questions for all the speakers, not just only for Sydney?
Just for me that his daughter is just arriving for a tour in Roma, so
Okay.
that's for me.
Oui. So, other questions for the speakers? No questions at all? Okay, one.
It's actually the question we discussed during the coffee break, and is for essentially for Antonio and maybe for Sydney as well, and maybe for concerning you all, because there is let's say there was the intuition from observation that people under strong stress tend to follow consolidated path. So to react according to what they learned in training and to strict rules, following just the rules. And while you were in your presentation, you were talking on knowledge, ability to solve problems. So the impression that was from observation in the past is that this is difficult. Recently, the results that comes from physiological studies confirm this theory in observing how the brain works. So when you are really under strong stress, there are some the observation based on the use of oxygen by the brain and magnetic resonance demonstrate that there are some activities, some part of the brains that are actually inhibited by the hormones that are liberated by the body. So that people really tend to use to be less able, they're using the part of the brain that is not able to reason, but just to react, to use part of the brain that is based on instinct, that probably the brain that we are selected to escape or to fight in particular conditions, not to reason. And this is actually, at this point, is really demonstrated by physiology. So we cannot expect under particular stress condition that people can really reason around what is happening with the same ability that he can provide in normal condition. So that still maybe the solution is strong training, or maybe the solution is for system that can support those particular status. That's the comment.
Thank you, Alberto. Well, I agree with you with most of what you said about the stress is an inhibition of our action because we have a tunnelized vision. We don't perceive correctly, we don't reason correctly, so our knowledge part of our action is inhibited somehow. So you said, why don't you put a computer instead of you? No? The problem is that no, you can surrogate the human ability with a computer. Actually, what I said about the skill, rule, and knowledge-based action, the organization has to train people to act on the skill and rule. Then the knowledge-based behavior is the exception, when we find out something very unexpected. I mean, situational surprise and fundamental surprise. We cannot deal with fundamental surprise because it's beyond our possibility. which is the situational surprise. We can cope with the situational surprise with the rule and skill and knowledge. When I solve the problem at the knowledge level, I have to report to my manager, to my training center, to say, I solved this problem this way. You take my feedback to put it in a rule-based knowledge, a rule-based action. It means we just find out a rule to solve this kind of problem that now is a known problem. The problem with us is that we have to deal with a known problem, the fundamental surprise. There is no recipe for that. Every time that I deal with something unexpected, with a situational surprise, I have to cope with and I report to the training manager, to the training system, to say, find out a solution that could be delivered to the whole population, fleet-wise, and all pilots or all operators. You talk about reaction time and stress as well. Well, it depends if there's a time critical or not. We are talking about controllers, pilots, and high-risk environments are based on a time-critical environment. So you have to cope with time. There is no recipe. So we have to consolidate a behavior at the rule-based level in the simulator. And for example, a stop takeoff and engine failure or something that could happen, that is a situational surprise, I have to train you so that when you are stressed, you just apply a consolidated behavior that you got in the past. This is the only track that you can follow. I don't know, Sidney, if you agree.
Yeah. And thank you. Yes, yes, I agree. The whole training for emergencies is founded on that idea. And as it turns out, and research seems to back this up, most emergency situations have more time than people often think. And it's so rushing through it and becoming stressed isn't even necessary. Now, that's hard to tell people because you will anyway. But yeah, in most cases, the consolidated script, if you overlearn it, has great advantages. Right? There are situations where overlearning a consolidated script is not so good, right? Because not all engine failures are the same, for example, or not all other emergencies are the same. But in principle, I fully agree, and in aviation, we have become reasonably able to accommodate that weakness of the tunneling, of the shrinking of cognitive capacity under those circumstances. So, yeah.
Moreover, the knowledge-based behavior and the deep knowledge is the thing that allows the pilots to be 5 minutes ahead of the aircraft. It means the knowledge-based behavior is to plan ahead in order to avoid problems. That's why we work on rule and skill when we are on the spot, but we use knowledge to anticipate problems in order not to be involved in problems later on. This is the main asset of the training.
I would like to point out one word that has been used many, many times and for many, many years here in Italy, and it is about training. Normally, training here in Italy is considered addestramento. It is not enough. We must consider something more. That is education, that is instruction, and that is culture. So what is lacking in our organization, in our environment, pilots, controllers, is that we do not have enough education, we do not have enough construction of culture. We have been trained to become controllers. Very few of us became consolidated professionals, not because we have had more education, or more knowledge, but because we did construct our own knowledge, our own education. It is time that we have something that organizes that. This is something that I would like to be pointed out.
Other questions? I have a question. Okay.
Instead of speaking English, because I forgot some of my English, I'm an old man, 85 years. Since I have been air traffic controllers since 1952, and after all, e dopo quel periodo, ho lavorato molto come controllore, ma anche come, tra virgolette, pensatore. I miei nipoti mi chiamano un ragazzo all'antica, il nonno tecnologico, e io ne sono orgoglioso, perché ancora oggi, partecipando a questo workshop, ho avuto il piacere di viverlo, di seguirlo. Quello che mi ha un po' intristito, lo dicevo al comandante Calastri, che io stimo moltissimo, come stimo tutti i relatori tra l'altro, è che molte delle cose che sono state dette oggi, purtroppo, io le ho discusse 30-40 anni fa, purtroppo dico. È vero, molte soluzioni sono state adottate, ma ci sono ancora dei problemi. Ne prendo uno solo, uno dei problemi che io ho vissuto sulla mia pelle, come controllore, come manager, come direttore generale dell'azienda di assistenza a volo, è stata la difficoltà del colloquio, come dicevo a Calastri, tra gli operativi e i tecnici. Questo è stato uno dei problemi più grossi che io ho avuto. Il tecnico tende a risolvere il problema dal suo punto di vista, ma nel controllo del traffico aereo, come per i piloti, il problema non deve essere risolto dal punto di vista tecnico, ma deve essere risolto dal punto di vista operativo, da chi poi assume responsabilità morali, penali, giuridiche e tutto il resto. Questo è uno dei problemi che ancora sussiste e non ho sentito purtroppo nelle relazioni fatte una menzione approfondita. È stato toccato il problema, ma non a sufficienza. Secondo me deve essere approfondito e deve essere affrontato con molta decisione, perché il pilota da una parte, a parte il fatto che oggi abbiamo sentito Calastri che ci ha parlato molto dei piloti, abbiamo sentito un po' meno parlare del lavoro dei controllori, perché purtroppo si vede che Artoni ha tirato fuori, ha fatto un ragionamento, ha detto una cosa che forse è giusta. Forse tra noi controllori, mi ci metto anch'io ragazzi, anch'io sono insieme a voi, tra noi controllori manca un po' la passione e l'amore per approfondire e per arricchire la nostra cultura. Ci manca, bisogna che noi ampliamo la nostra cultura, non possiamo fare solo i controllori davanti al radar, dobbiamo anche sapere che cosa fa il radar, come è fatto, che cosa fa un ILS, che cosa fa un sistema informatico. Io ho avuto la fortuna che mio fratello gemello, Camillo, che qualcuno lo conosce forse, si è inventato l'ATCAS. L'inventore dell'ATCAS sul piano operativo è stato lui, per cui essendo gemelli abbiamo fatto delle lunghe chiacchierate in materia e poi molti dei realizzatori dell'ATCAS, con i quali io mi sono confrontato aspramente anche. Ripeto, il problema è che non c'è abbastanza colloquio tra operativi e tecnici. Grazie e ci vediamo a Cina.
Other questions? I have a question, a comment and a question for everybody, for Sydney, mainly for you. Since we live in complex open systems, where is the boundary between the system where we are working in? I'm thinking about a hospital or a air traffic control tower, etc., and the outside system. So you can draw a line inside the system and you distinguish between what is good and what is bad. But where is the other line? Because I spoke with many safety managers and they said, I have a double bind. My first need is to promote safety with a just culture, etc., inside my environment. But my other need, my other bind, is to respond to somebody else, which is outside, is the judge, the prosecutor, and I will be prosecuted if I don't blame somebody inside my system. So, how to balance this?
Let me give two answers. So part of the first answer lies squarely in the terrain of our philosopher king, Captain Chialastri, because it's ultimately an epistemological or even ontological question. But Paul Cillier, a complexity scientist, has written about this, I think, most lucidly. His answer to the question of where the boundary goes is this. He says the boundary in a complex system is folded in, is everywhere. Every single agent inside of a complex system has boundaries to the outside world. So there isn't a boundary around the whole thing. You can listen to Italian now. There isn't a boundary around the whole thing. No, the boundary is folded in. Right? So everybody interacts with the outside world. Now, that's philosophically nice, but it doesn't answer the second or the other part of the question, which is how do you deal with these accountability pressures that are imported from the outside and that you somehow need to respond to? I think there's a long-term and a short-term answer. In the long term, I hope and I have the confidence that humanity is able to move to new systems of governance, to new systems of accountability. We've done this through the European Enlightenment, we've done this through the scientific revolution, through secularization. We've changed the way we hold each other accountable throughout the history of humanity. So we are capable of change. But it doesn't happen within the career of a safety manager, because it's typically 2 or 4 years. Boom, that's it, right? So as a safety manager, I think you have this no escaping of the double bind. On the one hand, you have to hold and meet these expectations in the outside world, while all the time suggesting your displeasure and disagreement, as well as suggesting alternative ways and testing the boundaries of possibility for those. I think then you are worth your job. Because if you don't do it, who does? Right?
It's a complex, very complex job.
Don't take the job if you don't like it.
Am I allowed to compliment a bit on this? I will switch on Italian just to cope with your expectation and let Sydney have the opportunity to use the headphones. E il boundary, il confine fra quello che è il gruppo sociale che assicura la safety ed il gruppo sociale che assicura un'altra esigenza fondamentale di tenuta sociale, cioè l'amministrazione della giustizia. Beh, noi abbiamo come associazione iniziato un dialogo serrato attraverso i FATCA con la Commissione sull'argomento liability, accountability e sull'area che Sidney ha disegnato sul pavimento di colore rosso, ma che dovrebbe essere bianco, grigio o nero. Siamo rimasti stuck in the mud, bloccati nel fango delle definizioni, e credo che abbiamo perso più tempo a cercare di dare una definizione consistente con il nostro lavoro, con la nostra visione, come se stessimo costruendo un documento ICAO. Beh, io credo che l'approccio sia errato. L'approccio che abbiamo per cui perseguito e su cui stiamo puntando molto in questo senso è il contatto diretto con il gruppo sociale che amministra la giustizia, in un'ottica innanzitutto di reciproco riconoscimento, di reciproca conoscenza, per cui di consapevolezza di cosa fa uno e cosa fa l'altro, senza mai mischiare o confondere i ruoli, ma in un'ottica di scambio, se volete, forse la parola culturale è esagerato, ma l'obiettivo è quello di avere quelli che venivano definiti messy details, il terribile caos dei dettagli tecnici reso disponibile in un linguaggio interpretabile a chi del campo non è. Beh, devo dire che i primi risultati, secondo me, grazie a qualche iniziativa che andrebbe comunque rinforzata e che spero venga perseguita nel prossimo ciclo di lavori, il risultato c'è stato. C'è stato nel senso di una serie di incontri che secondo me ha mostrato un reciproco interesse, anche se poi nessuno durante quegli incontri ha espresso una volontà di incontrarci poi oltre quell'ambito in un'aula di tribunale. Siamo ben consci del problema. Però questa iniziativa c'è per sottolineare come, a mio avviso, ci siamo evoluti in questo come associazione, e direi che le 5 domande che poniamo e che criticamente di proposito teniamo sempre presenti nei confronti della nostra organizzazione sono le 5 domande basilari che poniamo anche rispetto a chi amministra la giustizia, cioè fino a che punto siete in grado di comprendere, fino a che punto possiamo scambiare, fino a che punto tenete conto di quello che è il contesto. Beh, il cammino sarà lungo, non ho risposte ottimistiche se non nel senso generale, cioè amo vedere il bicchiere mezzo pieno, soprattutto dopo averne bevuto la metà, insomma.
Other questions?
My name is Maurizio Scholz, and I'd like to say thank you to Sydney for your very nice and impressive presentation, and also to Antonio for the automations presentation that he made us. I'm particularly interested in better understanding what does it mean, accountability. As you know, in our Italian language, we translate accountability and responsibility without any difference. Just to clarify myself, which is the real meaning. I remember many years ago, a friend of mine, it was a UK colleague involved in safety nets. He told me a story, a very nice story, just to explain me which is the difference between accountability and responsibility. He told me that he said me, imagine a nuclear power plant. Suddenly you heard an explosion. People escaping from the plant with helmet and the screwdriver in the hands, they are responsible. On the contrary, vice versa, the gentleman with tie and the jacket running fast toward the plant, they are accountable. And this is a nice story just to clarify ourselves the importance to better understand the message that Sydney gave us. On the same field, I would like to stress even the importance to understand which is the border between the success in the organization, which is the border in the management the targets, and which is the staff awareness, how much is involved staff in the process, and which is the outcome, the final outcome. In many cases, in the organization, the industrial plan, the industrial documents, is the main part in which have been included all the targets that had to be achieved in the, for instance, 5 years. But during this plan, how many times people are involved just to check if we are on the track, we are still continuing to meet targets, and which are the deviation from the targets. This could be a compromise between the staff and the organization to embark the staff also in the management achievements, not only in the operational achievement. In many cases, this is the main risk in the organization when the top management works alone in the very high stratification without involving people, the staff, in dressing the strategy. So this is my opinion, just to share with you. And in many cases, I would say that probably we have also some problems with regard to regulation. In many cases, we are familiar with the problems that belong to our working environments, and we have a lot of problems with the regulation first, just to verify which is the links, the possibility to understand which is the meaning of the regulation in our tasks. We feel the regulation as a bureaucracy, but vice versa, sometimes we need to be regulated, provided that the regulation is spread in a proper manner. So I would say that in some sense the regulation could be understood clearly from the frontline operators, provided that it is explained in a clear manner. In some cases, to my understanding, the regulation is not so well understood. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask you, Mr. Decker, one thing, and the other one is directed to everyone else, everyone also here. The first one is about incident analysis. You said that has been demonstrated that incident analysis in a safe environment is quite useless. But my understanding is that you must keep on analyzing to keep the system safe.
Exactly. Keep where it is.
Okay.
Exactly right.
Okay. And the second one is a real question, and I'm asking if you know if there is an aviation regulation which refers to safety 2 principles at the moment.
I think that the current status, as everyone knows, is the ICAO SMS, and is looking into safety one mainly, and that's why we are in this discussion, to see that we need to improve the tools that we have. And they talk about the reactive, proactive, and predictive, and we would like to emphasize in the proactive ideas. So I think that there is still room to complement this safety one with this safety two thinking. I don't know.
It's a very good question. I think with a lot of fantasy and a very open mind, you could see regulations directed to TRM or CRM as playing with safety too, as the insertion of extra capacities and competencies and positives that people can then work out themselves in a way. The other thing that you could vaguely associate with safety too is system level regulation. So rather than looking at the nuts and bolts, you look at the processes that people have in place to administer certain things and to organize certain things. And rather than a regulator, you become more of an auditor. That sort of confidence that people are able to become resilient, or an organization is able to become resilient and understand the harm that may come its way and do things to forestall that, to keep that from happening, and then tell the regulator about it, in a sense, is toying with the boundaries of safety too. But anything that is obviously and explicitly safety too, I haven't seen yet. So there's certainly that room for improvement, but very good question.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because it takes into consideration the stakeholder deciding the 4P, the philosophy, the policies, procedures, and practices. Who decides the philosophies? No, at the international level, who decides? Who is the stakeholders? We don't know. We know just who makes the policies. Policies, the procedures, your boss. And the practices, this is the community practice that every day, on an everyday operation, it put in progress some work. The work has done, really done. The main problem is who decides the philosophy. This is an open question for me. And I'd like to answer to Fabrizio's question about inside and outside and the boundary. Taken from biology, the DNA is everywhere. So the ancient question about is what is born before or earlier, the egg or the hen? This is a question that has no answer. Is there no answer? Because I don't know if it's understandable, but phenotype and genotype. Genotype is the DNA. The DNA is the information, but the genotype is made of matter. The hen is the phenotype, but it's made by DNA. So both, they are genotype and phenotype together. So this is no difference between inside and outside. Which is our DNA? Our DNA is the overall philosophy of the organization that we keep inside us as a training. We are trained to perform according to the organization philosophy. And that's what education, culture, training, and checking is aimed for.
Going in the field of philosophy and theology. Be quiet, please.
That requires a beer.
Any other question? So just to conclude, let me say, I'd like to share with you my impression about today's meeting. So, and then I'll let you conclude. Yes. You can do it, or you can just think about it. So, think about writing your signature on a piece of paper. Think about it. What you do. You use your hand, take a pen, and write it. That's it. It's easy, quick, normal, as usual. Now, change your hand. What's the first thought you have? What's the first feeling you have? When you put the pen in the other hand and you try to write your signature, what's the feeling? What's the thought? Please, tell me. Oh, what?
First, I have to understand how to hold the pen.
Yeah. And this is the feeling, I should stand up? Okay. This is the feeling that I could have, or people could have, listening to these things. Wow, that's complex. It's difficult to use that method, the Fram method. It's difficult to see human beings not as stupid things that should be fixed by automation. It's difficult to think about no boundaries and complexity and emergent properties. It's difficult, yes, it is. But this is the challenge. So we could swap the hand and write the signature with the other hand if we want it, if we need it. If we need it, because if I break my right hand, I need to write and I learn the knowledge and then it becomes skill. But it's difficult. I think that today, nowadays, we need to change hand, to change point of view. It takes time, it's difficult, it's not easy and not quick, as you said. Antonio told me a little story because he's such a brilliant guy. He told me that may I say this? I know. Okay. He said that when he flies and he has time, in order to keep train, he writes the Divina Commedia with the other hand, left hand, in order to improve his two-sided brain, etc. So, probably everybody in this room and also outside should try to use the other hand, to use a different perspective on everyday work. And this is something slow, and I think at the beginning it wasn't that easy to write with the other hand. Okay? So you will make mistakes, as everybody does. But this is the only way to go on and to change attitude and go into words. That is new perspective. So that was my take-home message. Thank you.
It has been a long day. It will be a long evening as well. I mean, hopefully accompanied by some beers or wine, whatever you prefer. So this time I will remain in English. Sorry for that. My task is to try to conclude. I decided to go by providing a thought, an example of what error-prone to a human being can do after this kind of discussion. And prone in Italian means incline, esposto. So, by order, from Tony, I definitely learned that Eurocontrol has decided to manage safety in the future by playing cards. From Yvonne, great, we are applying chemical to analysis for safety purposes. All the nucleus you were showing in the slides. From Paola, Deep Blue has finally succeeded in stopping Cesar initiative by trying to allocate liability layers to automation. From Antonio, Chialastri, definitely Chialastri. Mabba, it's an African poison snake. From Sydney, that's your turn. Now we know there are some Napolitans in Australia. So, let's try to be serious. Sorry for that. It's sort of stretching the mind, at least. Basically, I'm surprised. I was involved in the past in many international initiatives in which safety and human performance, as is defined now was basically reacting to other needs coming from other part of the industry. I mean, it's economical, political, but definitely nothing to do with our business. So what I perceive, and I kept on, is we are definitely now facing a change, not only in mood, but also in thinking. And we have decided to change our perspective by first of all maintaining our approach to safety and to the human being as the kernel, as the main actor of the system. Definitely what we have to reinforce at association level will be matter of discussion, hopefully tomorrow, is the initiative we did initiate some time ago, it's not that long, with the other social group with administrating justice. And to keep this kind of initiative maybe happen a little bit often than now. I was skeptical on this. I have now to recognize that we have, first of all, to repeat this kind of experience, and secondly, to try to get all our high-level management involved as far as possible, because there is a lot to be said on this. Thank you very much. I will offer a couple of barrels of beer, or whatever you prefer, just to get a little bit relaxed.
E l'ultima targa ovviamente per Fabrizio. Ora, se vi va, mi aiutate a fare quella cosa che volevo fare prima, la foto tutti quanti insieme. A picture all together with Evelyn. We'll quick things. Come here, Evelyn. Let's get all the audience behind, please.